Again, we're picking up right where we left off in the previous video, still taking a look at some of the settings for Bevel and Emboss, and in this video we're going to focus on the contour and texture settings. Now these are special features of the Bevel and Emboss layer style that you can use or not use as you see fit based on the checkboxes next to them inside the styles list. Now to make these a little more apparent, I'm going to start off by taking my Bevel and Emboss structure settings and increasing the size to really make that bevel seem to stand out. Next, we'll go down and switch on contour, and we'll click on contour to go into the contour settings. Now, all this is really going to give you is a simple contour window. And what you're doing here, what you're controlling, is the shape of the bevel transitioning from the lowest point to the highest point. And you can already tell it's not an exact replica of exactly the behavior you're seeing, because here you see a straight line, but obviously the contour suggested here is curved. So really, in the end, you're just mapping a relationship. Right now, it's a linear relationship over what we've already defined using our settings as a curved surface. What defined that, in case you're curious, if you're like, well, what was the definition, is the fact that we're using a smooth technique as opposed to like a chisel hard or a chisel soft. Smooth means we will get this nice flowing transition, and contour of linear just means we're linearly mapping across that smooth contour, just so there's no confusion. Now, we can make changes to this curve, and you can see, like, if we do kind of an ease in, like so, to the far end, you see that we are kind of tightening up that relationship at the end. We could do something like an S curve. And you can see how the bottom of the surface appears to stay kind of flat. If I take this point and just hit delete on it and we remove that, then we can flatten out the bottom. And naturally, you can do all kinds of cool stuff like do fun little zigzaggies. And you can see how that works. Now, one thing I do want to point out that is very cool, and actually, let me do this. Let me grab just linear one more time. And I like the zigzaggy, but let me do a few less, because at this resolution, that's going to be really hard to read. So we'll go ahead and just go with just a couple of zigzags. Now, if we check the anti-alias box, you'll really see a difference here. If you look very closely at the edges of my bevel, things look very, very jaggy, especially at the areas of the body of the stick figure. And if I turn on anti-aliasing, it really does a good job of smoothing those out. So while I don't often find myself needing to use the anti-alias checkbox for a contour window, in this particular case, it works quite well. So remember to use that. Next, we have the range slider. And what this will do is allow you to control how far into the surface the curve you've defined is going to start. So by kicking this up, you're kind of pushing the effect out, and by sliding it down, you're squeezing the effect in. And you can see the result just by playing with the slider. Now, moving down from here, if I go ahead and turn off contour, we have texture. What texture is going to do is use an existing pattern, kind of like a bump map. Now, if you're a 3D person and I say bump map, you probably just nodded and you're like, okay, I totally understand, makes perfect sense. If you are not a 3D animation person, you don't work with a lot of 3D packages, you're probably like, well, what is a bump map? What this pattern is defining is areas of elevation using a grayscale image. Let me grab something that's got a lot of contrast to it. And if you take a close look at this pattern, you'll see that primarily it's an area of white with some little dark swirlies added throughout it. What this defines in terms of the Bevel and Emboss layer style is that the white areas are raised spots of the texture. The black areas are indentations. And so you can see how that's already having an effect on our result. We have this kind of swirly effect that seems to be covering the surface of our layer. Now, we can do a few things with this. We can create a new preset from the current pattern. So if we like what we have here, we can just click on this and it'll save that as a new preset, which I'm not actually going to do here. If you are using Photoshop CS5, let me mention this kind of often as an aside. If you only see like a couple of patterns here and you don't have anywhere near as many as I do, and you're like, hey, wait a minute, where do you get all those cool patterns? The way you can get to those is by clicking on this little tiny black arrow, and then there are several different patterns you can add in here. So if I grab, say, patterns 2, which I don't think I currently have loaded, you can choose to either replace the existing patterns with those, or you can just append them to the list. And now I have even more patterns to choose from. So that's where you can go and find more. So we can grab this kind of cotton ball-y looking one. You see it, and because of the way the system works, those white areas are kind of raised out, and we get this kind of pit effect like you see here. Now, we can snap this to the origin. The reason that's kind of important is that if you click and drag in the document while you're in your texture settings, you can slide this texture around. Now that's important if you have a particular pattern that you need to align with your layer just so. You can do that manually in a nice intuitive fashion, or you can click snap to origin and that'll reset the position back to where it belongs. You can also scale your pattern up and down, which is very cool. Watch out about scaling it too far, though, because you can really start to see some pixel jaggies in there. And, of course, scaling it too far down means that you get a lot of heavy repetition, and it can be very easy to see that you have kind of a problematic pattern. Or if you find that nice average in between the two, you can end up with something that looks pretty random and kind of pleasing to the eye. Next, you have a depth scale. This controls how far into the surface this pattern will appear to be pushed. So there you can see we're kind of pushing out, so now the rounded areas are kind of sticking out. And if we flip that around, now the rounded areas are kind of poking back in. Two entirely different looks from the exact same pattern. You can also choose to invert the effect, which is just like sliding the depth scale in the, the depth slider in the opposite direction. So however you want to do that. And then you can link with the layer. Now this is on by default, and I just want to show you how this works. If I click OK to go ahead and commit this, and I grab my move tool and start to move this around, take a close look and notice that the pattern is coming right along like these are all the exact same object, like it's all just one big bitmap or something. If I go back into my Bevel and Emboss settings, however, and go down to Texture, and I switch off Link with Layer, now take a look at what happens when I move the layer. That pattern appears to kind of swim across the surface. That's because the pattern is stationary while our layer is not. So it's just you kind of determining whether or not you need your layer to move along with that. In most cases, this will be left on, which is why it's there by default. But if for some reason you need the two to be completely separate, it's a great way to do it. Okay, so that's a look at the contour and texture settings, which wraps up this video and also wraps up our discussion of the Bevel and Emboss layer style effect. Thank you very much for watching.